This Diocese of Houma Thibodeau program is brought to you by Crosby Tugs.
God's people had come into the promised land and were receiving the promise that God had made to Abraham like 500 years before that. But they were fickle. They were like going back and forth. They would serve God and then they would serve their own desires. They would worship God and then they would worship false gods. They were going back and forth over 40 years and more than 40 years even. And now, when their leader, Joshua, which is Hebrew for Jesus, when their leader, Jesus of the Old Testament, Joshua, who was anointed as their leader following Moses, was about to die, he said to them, "Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." You got to make a choice. Are you going to serve God? Or are you going to serve something or someone else? And that's the choice that Jesus presents to us at the end of our gospel passage today. Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous mammon, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal habitations. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. But in another place, Jesus says that you can't serve both God and mammon. In fact, that's just a couple lines later, also in this reading, both in Luke and in the Gospel of Matthew. You cannot serve both God and mammon. What is mammon? Mammon is like the things we need for life. So think like money, food, shelter, some measure of security, those things, like the things you need for life. If you look it up in the Greek dictionary, it says sustenance, like those things that sustain us. And Jesus says he opposes serving God, and oftentimes in the Bible, to serve means to worship. So we could perhaps say Jesus is opposing serving God and serving the things that we need for life. Not that those things aren't important. We do need food, and we do need clothing, and we do need shelter, and we do need a certain amount of money to pay our bills and to go about our life and to all these things, and that's not bad. But it is bad when we begin to put the mammon, the stuff, the money before the Lord. When we begin to serve it or to worship it, rather than letting it serve us. And in some ways, that's the root of all sin, or at least most sin, is that the things that should be serving us, like money or like food or like all the good things of the world, we begin to serve them. And it's only when we put ourselves at the service of God that we become free from enslavement to all these things of the world. In St. Matthew, when he's writing his gospel, he gives us this saying about you cannot serve both God and mammon right before he tells us not to be anxious, not to be worried. How much of our disorder of things, how much of our putting the things of this world over God comes because we're worried? How often or how many people commit the sin, which in some cases is a mortal sin, of working on Sundays when it's unnecessary, because we're not secure that God is going to provide for us? I don't mean if you own a hospital and you have to send your workers to work so that people don't die. I don't mean if you own a chemical plant and a certain percentage of your people have to work so that it doesn't explode and cause a disaster. But how many of us who own businesses send our employees to work when we don't really need to? How many of us choose to work on Sundays when we don't really have to? So often because we are untrusting, because we don't trust the Lord to provide. On the other hand, how many of us put our own pleasure before the Lord? How many of us are going fishing or at baseball games or soccer games or this or that with more importance than worshiping the Lord, than taking time to rest, than spending time with our families? Especially those who can't go so much, especially people like our grandparents who are elderly or who are unable to move around with us. What if we put the Lord first? What if we allowed the Lord to be the king of our lives? I'll tell you what if. We would be more free. We wouldn't feel the need to do all the things that take us away from Him. And those pleasures that we do enjoy in life, the ball games and the swimming pool and the hanging out with our friends and the fishing and the hunting and all those things, man, they would be even more fun. They would be even better if we're privileged to be able to do them, because they don't rule us, but rather we rule them. Or to say it a different way, because all those things of the world serve us to help us to live good and holy lives. We don't serve them. And a big part of that is, what do we do with our money? Do I hoard my money, or do I give it away? And I don't mean that we shouldn't have appropriate savings and investments that are ethical and saving for retirement, all those things. No. Of course we should. But are we hoarding it as if having this much money will make me secure? Because it doesn't. This much, when I get this much, then I think I need this much. And when I get this much, I think I need this much. And when I get this much, I think I need this much. And so do I hoard, or do I trust? Do I serve the poor? This is what Jesus says, right? Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous mammon. In other words, all this stuff that you have, that doesn't belong to you anyway, right? Because all the money comes from God. You say, well, I worked for that. Well, who gave you a healthy body to work for it? Or who gave you, or I invested wisely and I saved. Well, who gave you a good mind and prudence to do that? It all belongs to God anyway. And so we should use it to serve God's people. We should use it to worship God, to build up the body of Christ, to help people to know Jesus in the corporal and the spiritual works of mercy. This whole invitation today from Jesus, pitting God against mammon, takes us back to the choice in Joshua. Choose this day whom you will serve. Choose this day if I will live in the freedom of the sons and daughters of God and the joy and eventually heaven, or in slavery to pleasure, to possessions, to power, to money, to stuff, to things of this world that leads us eventually, if we allow it to get to mortal sin, to the destruction of hell. Let us live in freedom. Let us do away with those things that turn us away from God. Let us, like Jesus says, engage in prayer, fasting, and especially almsgiving, not just during Lent, but throughout the year, so that we might better live in the glorious freedom of the children of God.
This Diocese of Houma Thibodeau program has been brought to you by Crosby Tugs.